Hello there, curious minds, and welcome aboard. Today's story begins not in a castle, but on a train. A young man is heading west, nearly broke, freshly betrayed, with nothing but a suitcase, a few coins, and a sketch of a mouse. That drawing, born out of desperation, would go on to change the world. You've probably heard of Walt Disney, but not like this. This is the story of his failures, obsessions, and the empire he built one stubborn dream at a time. And if you stay with us till the end, I'll tell you something most people don't know about the message Walt left behind in his office, still untouched to this day. But before we dive into it, take a second to support the story. Give it a like, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment telling me what region you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, find your comfiest blanket, silence the outside world, and let your imagination stretch its legs. We're heading into the mind of a man who refused to stop dreaming. Before the empire, before the mouse, before a single frame of steamboat Willie ever flickered across a screen, there was just a boy born in a small house in Chicago on a snowy day in the year 1901. His name was Walter Elias Disney. But Walt never truly belonged to the industrial buzz of Chicago. Not in spirit, anyway. His early childhood was spent on a farm in Marceline, Missouri, a place that would leave a lasting imprint on his imagination. The fields, the small-town charm, the trains whistling in the distance. Decades later, he'd modeled Disneyland's Main Street after it. To him, Marceline wasn't just home, it was ideal. His father, Elias Disney, was strict and often distant. He believed in hard work and discipline, but not necessarily in dreams. He expected his sons to earn their keep early, and Walt was no exception. As a kid, Walt worked a grueling paper route with his brother Roy, up before dawn, snow or shine, delivering papers across town, even on school days. It was exhausting, thankless work, but it taught Walt something he'd never forget: discipline, repetition, and persistence, even when you're too tired to care. But Walt wasn't only hauling newspapers. He was always drawing, on scraps, on cardboard, on the margins of his homework. Whenever he could, he'd sketch animals, trains, faces, imaginary places. He carried around pencils the way other boys carried marbles or slingshots. Art was his escape, his language, his rebellion. Eventually, the family moved back to Chicago, where Walt enrolled at McKinley High School. There, he began to draw cartoons for the school paper, political sketches, sports cartoons, and at night, he took art classes at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. He was already restless, already dreaming of more than newspaper ink and school desks. But the real spark came during World War I. Too young to enlist, Walt lied about his age and joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. Instead of bullets, he carried wounded soldiers. Instead of uniforms, he wore a smile. And of course, he kept drawing, even decorating his ambulance with cartoons. The war wasn't glamorous, but it opened his eyes. He came back home with a broader view of the world, and absolutely zero interest in a normal life. By the time Walt returned from France, he was convinced. He was going to be an artist, a commercial artist, an animator, whatever that meant at the time. So at just 19, he packed a suitcase and headed for Kansas City. Now, Kansas City wasn't exactly the land of opportunity for animators, mostly meatpacking and railroads. But Walt found work at a small studio called Pesman Rubin, where he created ads for local businesses. That's where he met Ub Iwerks, a quiet, brilliant draftsman who would become his closest creative partner for years to come. The two of them started freelancing, working late nights and weekends to develop short animated ads. It wasn't glamorous work, but Walt was hooked. He saw something others didn't yet. Animation could be more than a novelty. It could tell stories. Soon after, Walt launched his own studio, Laugh-O-Gram Films. He convinced investors, hired staff, and began producing modernized fairy tales with a whimsical, youthful charm. They were clever, fresh, full of heart. But Walt was no businessman. Not yet. He overspent. He undercharged. And within months, the studio was deep in debt. He could barely afford food. He slept on a couch in the office. He begged for scraps to finish his last cartoon, Alice's Wonderland. And when that failed too, he did the only thing left. He borrowed $50 from his brother, bought a one-way train ticket to Los Angeles, and left the ruins of Laugh-O-Gram behind. No money, no job, but a suitcase and a reel of film that he refused to let go of. What Walt didn't know was that the film in his hands, rejected by Kansas City, would become the seed of a whole new life in Hollywood. And what was inside that reel? A little girl, a live actress, running through a cartoon world. But that's a story for next time. Because next, we'll explore how Walt arrived in California, pitched a crazy idea that nobody understood, and took his very first steps toward building an empire, starting not with a mouse, but with a rabbit. When Walt stepped off the train in Los Angeles, he wasn't the man people would one day call a genius. He was 21, broke, sunburnt, and living in his uncle's house. There was no studio, no staff, no big plan. All he had was that one short film, Alice's Wonderland, and a stubborn belief that it could be the start of something big. Most studios in California were focused on live-action features. Cartoons were still a sideshow, silent, jittery, and cheap. But Walt had a different idea. He wanted to mix live action and animation in a single story. A young girl, Alice, falling into a world drawn by hand. It was strange, bold, and surprisingly charming. He started sending it to distributors, and to his surprise, a company in New York bit. Margaret Winkler, one of the few female power brokers in the industry, agreed to distribute the Alice comedies. Just like that, Walt and his brother Roy set up shop in a tiny office behind a real estate agency. They bought a camera, used Roy's hospital bed as a table, and opened Disney Brothers Studio. It was barely a company, but it was enough. Over the next few years, Walt produced more Alice comedies, and with each short, the animation grew sharper, the stories funnier. It wasn't revolutionary yet, but it was a start. As the series wrapped up, Walt began looking for his next star. He wanted a fresh character, something funny, energetic, unique. What he came up with was a rabbit, not just any rabbit, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. He was snappy, mischievous, fast on his feet. Oswald's big ears and bouncy moves caught the attention of audiences immediately. By 1927, Oswald was a hit. Merchandise followed. Walt's studio grew. For the first time, it felt like things were working. But success, as Walt would learn, can be a tricky thing, and contracts can hide sharp knives. In 1928, Walt traveled to New York to renegotiate his deal with the distributor, now under Charles Mintz, Margaret Winkler's husband. Walt believed he'd proven himself. He wanted better terms, a fair cut, a little respect. Instead, he got ambushed. Mintz had secretly hired away most of Walt's animators. He reminded Walt that Oswald was legally owned by the distributor, not by Disney. And unless Walt accepted a reduced deal and smaller profits, Mintz would move forward without him. Walt was stunned. He'd lost his character, his team, his momentum. The train ride home from New York could have been the end. It had every right to be, but Walt didn't let it. Sitting in the train car, somewhere between disappointment and fury, he opened his notebook and started sketching. He drew a mouse. The story's been told so many times that it almost feels like folklore. A quiet man on a train, drawing a cartoon that would one day rule the world. But here's what matters. Walt didn't just draw a new character. He rebuilt his entire identity right there in that moment. He decided no one would ever take his work from him again. The next creation would belong to him, entirely. Back in Los Angeles, he showed the drawings to Ub Iwerks, his trusted animator and friend. Ub refined the design, rounder features, bigger ears, softer eyes. And just like that, Mortimer Mouse was born, or so Walt thought. His wife, Lillian, took one look and said, "Mortimer's too pompous. How about Mickey?" It stuck. Walt and Ub worked in secret, pouring all their remaining energy into a brand new cartoon, Plain Crazy. It featured Mickey flying an airplane in wild, rubbery hijinks, but without sound, it didn't stand out. Then came the game changer, Steamboat Willie. Walt saw what talkies were doing to live-action films, adding music and synchronized sound, and realized animation needed to evolve, fast. He bet the entire studio budget on recording sound for Mickey. It was an enormous risk. When Steamboat Willie premiered in November 1928, audiences didn't just laugh, they were shocked. The sound matched perfectly. The music bounced with the animation. Mickey squeaked, whistled, and winked his way into history. Almost overnight, Mickey Mouse became a household name. Finally, Walt Disney wasn't just an animator. He was the animator. But with fame came new challenges. Now that Mickey was famous, others wanted a piece. Merchandise deals, copyright questions, the pressures of delivering hit after hit. Walt had gotten what he wanted. Recognition, success. But it came with a cost. And still, he wanted more. Because for Walt, Mickey wasn't the end goal. He was just the beginning. By the early 1930s, Mickey Mouse had become a cultural phenomenon. His wide eyes and high-pitched charm were printed on lunchboxes, watches, and even gas masks. Walt Disney, once the boy sketching in the margins of his notebook, was now the head of a growing studio with over 100 employees and a slate of successful short films. But Walt was restless. He never saw cartoons as just gags and giggles. For him, animation was a form of storytelling, one that hadn't even begun to scratch its potential. While his animators were perfecting their timing on 7-minute shorts like the band concert and the Three Little Pigs, Walt was dreaming much bigger. He wanted to make a full-length animated feature, 90 minutes, in color, with depth, music, emotion, and a real plot. A film that could rival the dramas of Hollywood, but with drawings. When he announced the plan, the industry laughed. Disney's folly, they called it. Animators whispered behind his back. Bankers tightened their wallets. Even Roy, his practical older brother and financial guardian angel, thought Walt had finally lost it. But Walt didn't care. He believed people would connect to animated characters the same way they did to live actors, if the story was honest, and the characters were drawn with soul. He chose Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a fairy tale most knew from childhood, but gave it gravity, real fear, real loss, real love. The risk was enormous. Walt mortgaged everything, his house, his studio, even his life insurance, to fund the production. The budget ballooned to nearly $1.5 million, an astronomical sum for a cartoon in the 1930s. He pushed his animators to learn new techniques, rotoscoping to make movements fluid, multiplane cameras for depth, watercolor backgrounds that looked like moving paintings. Some days they barely slept. Some weeks they thought it would never end. Meanwhile, the press mocked the idea. Investors panicked. Roy begged him to stop. But Walt doubled down. He wasn't just trying to make a film. He was trying to prove something. That animation could be more than a joke. That it could hold sorrow, suspense, even silence. That dwarfs could grieve, and a princess's song could make an audience cry. By the end of 1937, the studio was out of money. They were working on credit, praying for a miracle. Then, on December 21st, in a glittering theater in Los Angeles, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered. The audience laughed, then gasped, then wept. When the lights came up, the room erupted in applause. Critics were stunned. Filmmakers were humbled. Charlie Chaplin called it the greatest motion picture ever made. The film became a box office smash, earning more than $8 million during its initial run. the equivalent of over 150 million today. Snow White wasn't just a success. It was a revolution. Animation had arrived. Suddenly, Walt Disney was not just the mouse guy. He was an auteur, a storyteller, an artist. But the cost of success lingered. Walt was never quite the same after Snow White. The pressure to top himself became unbearable. He poured the profits into bigger, more complex projects: Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi. Each film pushed the limits of animation, but not all of them made money. Fantasia, though now considered a masterpiece, flopped on release. So did Pinocchio. The studio went into debt. Morale wavered. And then came the strike. Many of Walt's animators, exhausted and underpaid, unionized and walked out. Walt saw it as a betrayal. The man who had once slept beside his animators in the studio now felt alienated from them. He began withdrawing from daily animation work, turning instead to new frontiers: live-action film, nature documentaries, and eventually something far more ambitious: a place, a world, a dream made real. But before he could build it, he had to survive another war, this time quite literally. After Snow White shattered expectations and box office records, Walt Disney had something most artists only dream of: creative freedom backed by millions. And yet, almost immediately, that freedom began to buckle under its own weight. Walt poured the earnings into even more ambitious films: Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi. Each was a technical marvel. Each pushed animation into bold, uncharted territory. And each one, tragically, lost money. Why? Because the world was changing. In 1939, Europe was on fire. Hitler had invaded Poland. War was spreading fast. Foreign markets, which had made up a huge part of Disney's earnings, closed overnight. As bombs fell overseas, audiences at home wanted comfort, not complexity. Walt had made art, but people wanted escape. The financial strain hit hard. The studio, now housed in a sleek new Burbank facility, was bleeding money. Layoffs followed. Morale plummeted. And in 1941, it boiled over into a full-blown labor strike. Many of Walt's employees, including some he considered close friends, walked out, demanding better pay, credit, and conditions. He took it personally, deeply. In his mind, he'd given them everything: jobs, opportunity, purpose. He couldn't see their side. To Walt, it felt like betrayal, and it broke something in him. The man who used to sleep on studio couches now found himself locked behind his office door, increasingly withdrawn from the people who had once built his dreams alongside him. Then came a letter from Washington. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government turned to Hollywood for help with the war effort. Walt's studio was commissioned to produce training films, propaganda shorts, and morale boosters for the military. Suddenly, Mickey Mouse was in uniform. Donald Duck was paying taxes. The Seven Dwarfs were promoting war bonds. It kept the studio alive, but it wasn't what Walt had set out to do. He hated making propaganda, hated the pressure, the limitations, the censorship. But he did it. Because he had to. Because payrolls needed to be met. Because the dream, bruised and buckled, still had to be protected. After the war, Walt was a changed man. Older, sharper, a little more suspicious. But he hadn't stopped dreaming. Instead, he started thinking bigger and stranger. He'd begun noticing how entertainment was starting to feel limited. Theaters were fine, but they were passive. He wanted something immersive, a place where families could go together, a world that moved, spoke, laughed, where every detail mattered, even the trash cans. He started sketching ideas. Rides that told stories, streets that looked like memories, a park that was safe, clean, and full of wonder. At first, no one understood. Roy, ever the realist, begged him not to go through with it. Friends said it would bankrupt him. Banks refused loans, but Walt was used to being doubted. He started funding the early planning himself, using money earned from television deals and licensing. He even created a fake company, Wed Enterprises, to keep the land purchases quiet. Why the secrecy? Because the land he wanted was in Anaheim. Cheap, swampy, unremarkable. If people knew Disney was buying it, prices would triple overnight. So Walt used pseudonyms, shell companies. He bought it acre by acre, silently assembling the foundation for something that didn't exist yet, something called Disneyland. And while this idea began to consume him, Walt still kept producing films. Cinderella, Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, they helped bring in cash. But in his heart, Walt wasn't thinking in frames anymore. He was thinking in footsteps, parades, and popcorn. He was building something you could walk through. But it wasn't easy. Every decision, from the layout of the streets to the curve of a lamppost, had to pass through Walt. He micromanaged everything. Staff called him obsessive. Some whispered it was ego. Others said it was fear, that he couldn't let go because, deep down, he knew this might be the last big swing he ever got. Construction began in 1954. Delays followed. Budget overruns. Technical failures. The press mocked the idea. They called it Walt's folly. Again, but Walt kept going. Because if animation let him bring drawings to life, this park would let him bring worlds to life. By July of 1955, after years of secrecy, setbacks, and near mutiny, Walt Disney stood at the gates of his greatest gamble yet. He had poured everything, money, pride, reputation, into a single idea. A theme park that wasn't just rides and cotton candy, but a living, breathing fantasy world where parents and kids could dream together. It was called Disneyland. But behind the colourful banners and smiling characters was a backstage filled with chaos. The park was nowhere near ready. Still, opening day came. Sunday, July 17th. And it was a disaster. They called it Black Sunday. From the start, it felt like fate had it in for Walt. The temperature soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Women's high heels sank into the freshly poured asphalt. Rides broke down. Drinking fountains didn't work. A gas leak forced the Fantasyland area to shut down, and the live broadcast, aired nationwide on ABC, was riddled with awkward pauses, technical hiccups, and flubbed lines. Even worse, someone had forged tickets. Over 28,000 people showed up, double the number invited. The park was flooded. Concession stands ran out of food. The staff couldn't keep up. One of the Mark Twain riverboats nearly tipped over from the weight of too many passengers. A tiger nearly escaped during a press tour. Lines stretched for hours. For many, it looked like the end of the dream before it had even begun. Walt, ever the showman, smiled through it. But he was shaken. He'd been humiliated on live TV. Friends warned him that the public would turn, that Disneyland would be his ruin. But something strange happened. The next day, people came back, and the day after that, and the day after that. Word spread, not just of the chaos, but of the magic. Children who met Snow White didn't care about the heat. Couples riding the Jungle Cruise didn't notice the motors sputtering. They remembered the wonder, the details, the feeling that somehow they'd stepped inside a story. Within weeks, Disneyland was drawing tens of thousands of visitors a day. The critics turned. The laughter returned. The dream, bruised but alive, had found its audience. And Walt? He didn't slow down for a second. He rode the park grounds daily in a suit and tie, inspecting, tweaking, listening. If a trash can was in the wrong place, he moved it. If a ride didn't tell a story, he shut it down. He was everywhere, scribbling notes, giving impromptu tours, watching how children reacted. Cast members were instructed to smile, to stay in character, to make every interaction part of the story. To Walt, Disneyland wasn't just a park. It was a prototype, a living show, a space that could grow and evolve, as long as he was there to shape it. Television, once seen as the enemy of cinema, became his greatest tool. The Wonderful World of Disney show became a Sunday night staple, broadcasting stories, park updates, and a carefully curated vision of American optimism directly into millions of living rooms. By the late 1950s, Disneyland was a hit. It was generating profits. New lands were added: Tomorrowland, Frontierland, New Orleans Square. Merchandise boomed. Other theme parks tried, and failed, to copy the formula. They didn't understand what Walt had always known. This wasn't about rides. It was about feelings. But Walt wasn't satisfied. He was already dreaming bigger, much bigger. He began to see flaws in the world beyond his gates. Cities were too chaotic, schools too rigid, traffic, pollution, poverty, all signs of what he called bad design. If he could build a fantasy park from scratch, could he build a better reality? He began working on something new, something bold, a planned city, a functioning prototype of tomorrow. He called it Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Not just a place to visit, but a place to live, where technology, creativity, and harmony would guide daily life. No slums, no crime. A society built not by politicians, but by designers. It was his biggest dream yet, and also his last. Because while Walt was building Tomorrowland on the outside, something far darker was quietly growing inside him. By the early 1960s, Walt Disney had built the most beloved theme park in the world, revolutionized animation, conquered television, and created characters known in every household across the country. But he was restless, as always. A man who saw the future not as a timeline, but as a blueprint he could redesign. While most businessmen would have slowed down, Walt sped up. He'd grown disillusioned with American cities, the traffic, the pollution, the mess. He believed society was falling apart because it had been built without imagination. So he started sketching again, not mice this time, but neighborhoods, transit systems, domed cities. He envisioned a self-contained, futuristic utopia, powered by clean energy and efficient design. A place where innovation lived around every corner, and problems were solved before they arrived. He called it Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. It wouldn't be a theme park. It would be a real city. People would live there, work there, learn there. No slums, no unemployment, no urban chaos. It would be clean, efficient, constantly evolving, always under Disney's careful guidance. The city would run on monorails. Trash would be vacuumed through underground tubes. Cars, not in the center. That space would be reserved for pedestrians, gardens, community. Technology and community working in harmony. Not just fantasy, function. But to build it, he needed land, lots of it. So, in complete secrecy, Walt launched a campaign of covert land acquisition in Central Florida, using fake company names like Reedy Creek Ranch and Tomahawk Properties. He began buying up swampland, orange groves, and farmland outside Orlando, acre by acre, deal by deal. No one knew it was Disney. Why all the secrecy? Because if word got out, prices would skyrocket. And besides, he wanted full control, not just of the land, but of the local laws. Eventually, Disney struck a deal with the Florida legislature to create the Reedy Creek Improvement District, giving him unprecedented authority over zoning, construction, even utilities. It was a private empire disguised as public development. By the time the press figured it out, Disney already owned over 27,000 acres. Walt's new project would include Epcot, a second Disneyland, a transportation hub, hotels, and more. It would be the largest private construction effort in American history. But then, the coughing started. Walt had been a lifelong smoker, not the filtered, casual kind, the hard, chain-smoking, never without one kind. In 1966, doctors found a tumor in his lung. It was cancer. He tried to keep working. He reviewed plans from his hospital bed, spoke with engineers, drew on napkins, but he was tired. And this time, even Walt couldn't outdream reality. On December 15th, 1966, Walt Disney died. He was 65. The world was stunned. Flags flew at half-mast. Newscasters cried on air. Children asked if Disneyland would close forever. But behind the grief came a much harder question. What now? Walt had been more than a CEO. He was the company, the storyteller, the visionary, the spark. Without him, the team felt adrift. His office was left untouched, desk as it was, chair still pulled out, drawings frozen in place. Staff would enter, quietly, look around, and leave, as if he might walk back in any minute. The Florida project was suddenly in jeopardy. Epcot, his dream city, had no completed blueprints, only concept art, scribbled notes, and hours of Walt talking to camera about a place he never got to build. But someone stepped forward. Roy Disney, his older brother, the numbers man, the steady hand, postponed his retirement, put on a tie, and took the reins. Quietly, with emotion in his voice, he made a public vow. Walt Disney World will be built, as my brother wanted. It will be dedicated to him. And he kept his word. 5 years later, on October 1st, 1971, Walt Disney World opened to the public. It included a theme park, a bigger, grander version of Disneyland, and the first stages of Walt's transportation dream. But Epcot, as Walt had imagined it, was never fully built. Instead, Epcot became another park, educational, futuristic, entertaining, but not a real city. The dream was too big, too complicated, too reliant on Walt himself. And yet, the spirit of it lives on, in smart city designs, in urban planning classes, in monorails and people movers and walkable spaces, and in a quiet room in Burbank, California, Walt's original office still exists, preserved just as he left it, and on one of the shelves sits a model of Epcot, waiting. Walt Disney left behind more than films, parks, and profits. He left behind a paradox, a man remembered both as a symbol of innocent magic and a hard-driving perfectionist who often burned the candle at both ends, and others with it. In the years following his death, the company continued to grow. The Jungle Book, the last film Walt personally touched, was released to acclaim. Disneyland expanded. Walt Disney World welcomed millions, and Mickey, once drawn on a scrap of paper during a train ride, became the eternal face of the brand. But the farther time moved from Walt's life, the more his image split. To some, he was the dreamer who gave the world colour during its greyest decades, someone who believed imagination could change reality. To others, he was a relentless taskmaster, stubborn, controlling, and at times politically polarizing. He demanded everything from his staff: long hours, absolute focus, and a willingness to chase perfection beyond logic. His creative highs often came at personal cost: strained friendships, family distance, emotional exhaustion. But Walt wasn't pretending to be perfect. He never tried to be a saint. He tried to build things no one else dared to. And he never stopped asking, what if? He was famously complicated. He could be warm and playful one moment, putting on mouse ears and joking with children, and cold the next, ripping apart a storyboard with a single glance. He disliked compromise. He distrusted bureaucracy. He hated losing. And yet, he inspired loyalty that lasted decades. The people who worked with him the longest didn't call him easy. They called him impossible and irreplaceable. Because Walt didn't just lead, he envisioned, he pushed, and most of all, he believed, often when no one else did. And that belief still echoes. Today, Disney is a vast corporate giant, far beyond anything Walt could have imagined. Marvel, Star Wars, theme parks on multiple continents, a media empire. But as the company grew, so did the question, what would Walt think? Would he have approved of the mergers, the reboots, the marketing machines? Hard to say. He always saw the company as a vessel for ideas, not the other way around. He once said, "I only hope that we never lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mouse." But really, it was started by something else, a refusal to stop dreaming. And perhaps no object captures that better than one small, ordinary piece of paper. In the weeks after Walt died, staff carefully entered his office to preserve it. His desk, just as he'd left it. Drawings, papers, coffee mug, untouched. And there, on the desk, was a note, just a name, scribbled casually, penciled in the margin of a yellow notepad. Kurt Russell. No explanation, no context. Just the name of a young actor who'd recently signed with Disney. At the time, Russell was a teen. Today, he still doesn't know what it meant. Was Walt planning a role, a film, a call? We'll never know. But in that note, simple, open-ended, you can still feel Walt's mind at work, always thinking forward, always preparing something. Even in his final moments, he wasn't looking back. He was planning. Because that's what Walt Disney did. He dreamed, he built, he failed, he tried again. He believed in trains that ran on time, mice that talked, and people who still believed in wonder, even when the world gave them every reason not to. He didn't just change animation. He redefined childhood. He turned storytelling into an experience. And he challenged every artist who followed to think just a little bigger, to imagine what could be, not just what was. We just finished walking through the world of Walt Disney, a man who turned drawings into dreams and fantasy into a functioning empire. But while he was sketching castles and building theme parks, another kind of architect had already redrawn the real world, not with blueprints, but with bandages, notebooks, and a lamp in her hand. And unlike Walt, she didn't build a kingdom of joy. She built a system that kept people alive. Tonight, we step into a different kind of story. One without applause, without fireworks, but with mud, blood, disease, and a woman who refused to look away. This is the untold story of Florence Nightingale, the woman who shaped modern nursing, redefined what it meant to care for the sick, and did it all while fighting the system every step of the way. And if you stay with me until the end, I'll tell you about the letter Florence wrote near the end of her life, the one historians still debate, that might explain why she walked away from the fame she never wanted. But before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now grab your warmest blanket, dim the lights, and follow the soft glow of a lantern. Because tonight, we're heading into the Crimean War, and into the corridors of a broken hospital, where one woman changed everything. Florence Nightingale was born into a world that didn't need her to be brilliant. It just needed her to be polite. It was May of 1820, and she entered the world in a Tuscan villa during a family tour of Europe, because that's the kind of life she was born into. Wealthy, educated, British, privileged. The second daughter of a socially connected family that had no plans for their girls beyond good marriages and excellent handwriting. But Florence wasn't interested in lace gloves and matchmaking. She wanted meaning. From a young age, she asked questions that made her governesses uncomfortable. Why were there poor people in such a rich country? Why were women allowed to host salons, but not run hospitals? Why did so many people die in institutions that were supposed to heal? She was reading philosophy while her peers were practicing piano. She studied Greek when others studied posture. By the time she was 16, Florence had already felt what she would later call her calling, a direct, almost spiritual sense that she was meant to do something more, something involving service, suffering, and systems. What exactly that meant, she didn't know yet, but she was determined to find out. Her family, of course, had other plans. The Nightingales weren't cruel, just conventional. Florence's father, William, was a liberal man by Victorian standards. He educated his daughters thoroughly, encouraging them to study languages, history, even mathematics. But when Florence started talking about working in a hospital, he balked. Nursing in the early 19th century was not considered a noble profession. In fact, it wasn't even considered respectable. Most nurses were poor, untrained, and often drawn from the same social class as their patients. Hospitals were filthy, overcrowded, dangerous, and nurses were sometimes associated with alcohol, scandal, or worse. For a girl of Florence's background to consider such a thing was, frankly, embarrassing. So, like any upper-class family under threat of scandal, they tried everything to distract her. Balls, vacations, courting eligible bachelors. Florence received at least one solid marriage proposal from a man who was wealthy, kind, and adored her. She said no, not because she didn't care for him, but because she knew marriage, in her world, meant surrendering her ambition, and she refused to trade her purpose for comfort. It was a bold decision. It meant alienating her family, facing ridicule from friends, living without the social protection marriage offered. But Florence didn't flinch. Instead, she started studying nursing in secret. She read every medical text she could get her hands on, studied statistics, observed clinics when allowed. And in 1849, when she was 29, she finally convinced her parents to let her travel to Egypt and Greece. A polite cover for what she really wanted: space to think, and a break from England's social cage. The trip changed her. She saw suffering that made the salons of London feel absurd. She met women working in religious medical orders, serving the sick not out of duty, but out of mission. And for the first time, she saw what nursing could be. Not just charity, but structure. Not pity, but science. When she returned to England, she took a bolder step. She enrolled at the Institute of Protestant Deaconesses in Kaiserswerth, Germany, one of the only reputable nursing schools in Europe. There she studied sanitation, wound care, and hospital management. She watched surgeries, cleaned wards, wrote extensive notes. By the time she returned home, she wasn't just Florence the headstrong daughter. She was Florence the trained professional. But Britain didn't know what to do with her. Even with her new skills, no one was hiring aristocratic women to run hospitals. So she began writing, publishing essays under pseudonyms, lobbying quietly for change. And finally, in 1853, she was appointed superintendent of the Institution for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in London. It was a start, small but real. What she didn't know was that halfway across Europe, a war was brewing. A war that would kill thousands, not by gunfire, but by infection. A war whose wounds would be deepened not by bullets, but by bureaucracy. And that war was about to make Florence Nightingale famous, for reasons she never wanted. In October of 1854, Florence Nightingale received the letter that would change everything. The Crimean War was raging, a brutal, confused conflict between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. But while soldiers died in the mud and snow of the battlefield, far more were dying off the field, in the overcrowded, disease-ridden military hospitals behind the lines. The British press had gotten wind of it. Journalists reported that wounded men were being left in corridors, starving, lying in their own filth. There were too few doctors, no clean water, no proper sanitation, and no one in charge. Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of War, and a friend of Florence's, asked her for help. Officially, publicly. He gave her a team, a title, and the impossible: fix the British Army's medical disaster, with little authority, little funding, and no guarantee anyone would listen. Florence agreed. Immediately. She assembled a team of 38 women, nurses, volunteers, and religious sisters, and sailed for Constantinople. From there, they travelled to Scutari, the site of the largest British military hospital in the war zone. What she found when she arrived wasn't just a crisis. It was hell. The hospital, housed in a massive stone barracks, was filled with over 2,000 wounded men. The stench hit before you entered the building. Blood pooled on floors. Rats ran freely. Lice and fleas were everywhere. Latrines overflowed. And the death toll was staggering. Men were dying more often from dysentery and cholera than from bullets. The army doctors didn't welcome her. In fact, many of them hated the idea of a woman, especially an upper-class woman, telling them how to run a hospital. Some refused to speak to her. Others openly mocked her. The army hierarchy was rigid, male, and prideful, and Florence was not interested in playing nice. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She got to work. She and her team scrubbed the floors, washed linens, set up kitchens to provide proper meals, organized storerooms, tracked supply shortages, improved ventilation. They bought equipment out of their own pockets when the army refused. She even hired soldiers' wives to serve as laundresses, giving them a role and restoring some dignity to a place that had none, and she tracked everything. Florence was a data person. She recorded death rates, infection sources, patterns in recovery, all by hand. She used those numbers as weapons, not just facts. With them, she proved what she already knew. Most of the soldiers were dying from neglect, not war. But the conditions were so bad that even her efforts couldn't stop the tide. In the first few months, death rates rose, up to 42%. The press started calling her a failure. Still, she worked. Every night, she walked the halls by lamplight, checking on patients long after the doctors had gone to bed. The soldiers began calling her the lady with the lamp. She became a symbol, not just of comfort, but of something deeper, a sign that someone still cared if they lived. Eventually, with the support of public donations and army pressure, Florence convinced the British government to send in a sanitary commission. They improved the sewage system, cleaned the water supply, and cleared the drains. The result? Death rates dropped from 42% to just 2%. Let that sink in. Not because of new medicine, not because of surgery, but because of clean sheets, proper nutrition, fresh air, and someone who paid attention. Florence Nightingale didn't save lives with magic. She did it with order. But while the soldiers began to heal, Florence herself was beginning to fall apart. The workload was endless, the emotional toll crushing. She saw hundreds die, wrote letters to grieving mothers, carried memories she would never shake, and worse, her health began to decline. By the time she left Scutari, she was ill, exhausted, and suffering from what we'd now likely call post-traumatic stress. Yet she never stopped working, even as she left the battlefield. Because Florence had realized something. The war was only part of the problem. The real disease was in the system. Florence Nightingale returned from the Crimean War not to a quiet homecoming, but to a tidal wave of fame she never asked for. The newspapers in Britain had already turned her into a legend. Artists painted her by lamplight. Poets compared her to saints. Young girls were named Florence by the thousands. She was called the Angel of the Crimea. But Florence didn't feel like an angel. She felt like someone who had seen too much and had far too much left to do. Her health, though, was in ruins. Most believe she contracted brucellosis or another chronic infection during the war. Whatever it was, it left her weakened, often bedridden, plagued by exhaustion and pain for the rest of her life. But here's what makes her remarkable. Even when she could barely walk, Florence kept working. From a small room in London, she began coordinating a quiet campaign, not for glory, but for infrastructure. She was now perhaps the most trusted woman in the country. She used that trust like a scalpel. The first target, the British Army. Florence believed that what happened in Crimea was not an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a broken system. So she wrote a massive, data-heavy report. Notes on matters affecting the health, efficiency, and hospital administration of the British Army. Over 900 pages of tables, statistics, observations, and blunt recommendations. It wasn't polite, it wasn't poetic, it was damning. And it worked, because Florence didn't just write reports, she visualized them. She used something now known as the coxcomb chart, a kind of early infographic, to show how deaths from disease far outpaced deaths from wounds. People who ignored words couldn't ignore her images. Within a few years, the army implemented wide-ranging reforms. Sanitation improved, ventilation was prioritized, medical training was standardized, mortality rates plummeted. Her work literally reshaped military health policy across the British Empire. And yet, she still wasn't done. In 1859, Florence published Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not. Unlike her other reports, this wasn't written for doctors or ministers. It was for the public, especially women, and it became the foundation of modern nursing education. It included practical advice on hygiene, diet, air, cleanliness, and patient observation. But more importantly, it framed nursing not as servitude, but as science, as professional, as vital. It was a radical shift. Until then, nursing had no clear status. Florence gave it definition, structure, respectability. The book was translated, reprinted, taught in schools, and shaped generations of caregivers. In 1860, with funding from the public and Queen Victoria herself, Florence established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. Graduates of her school went on to lead nursing programs across Britain and around the world, from India to Australia to the United States, and still, she worked from her sickbed. She advised on hospital design, developed sanitation standards, consulted with India's colonial health system, and pushed for reforms in workhouses, army barracks, and rural communities, all without leaving her room. She became known, half-jokingly, as the general in her dressing gown. And that nickname wasn't entirely wrong, because while men in uniform debated policies in Parliament, Florence was deploying facts, numbers, arguments built on lived experience. She didn't storm into meetings. She sent papers, letters, diagrams, and quietly, over time, she got what she wanted. But fame had its shadows. As she aged, Florence became increasingly reclusive. She refused interviews, avoided public events. Many young nurses never met her in person. Her health continued to decline, and she suffered periods of depression and anxiety, likely worsened by the memories of war she never fully escaped. Yet her work never stopped being relevant. By the 1880s, she was one of the most decorated civilians in British history. She received the Royal Red Cross, later the Order of Merit, the first woman ever to do so. But Florence didn't hang her medals on the wall. She tucked them away. She hadn't done this to be remembered. She had done it so that fewer people would die in pain, unseen and unheard. By the 1880s, Florence Nightingale no longer walked the hospital halls. She rarely appeared in public. Most people never saw her face again. But if you think her influence had faded, think again. Because from her modest home at 145 South Street in London, Florence was still shaping the future of health. Quietly, methodically, relentlessly. By then, her name had travelled far beyond Britain. Nurses trained at her school were working across the world, in India, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Her approach to hygiene, patient care, and hospital design had been adopted by governments and health systems on nearly every continent, and her words were still being read, quoted, studied, not just by medical professionals but by engineers, architects, and social reformers. She was no longer just the lady with the lamp. She was now something larger, a symbol, a standard, a system. But Florence never cared for monuments or marble statues. She refused public celebrations, declined portraits. When Queen Victoria offered to host an event in her honour, Florence politely declined, citing poor health, but really, she simply didn't want the spotlight. She had always believed the work was more important than the name attached to it. Yet, the name kept spreading. In the year 1893, a new nursing college in America opened, and it bore her name. Hospitals were named after her, scholarships, lecture halls, even a rare species of bird in Australia. She never asked for any of it. At home, her world grew smaller. Her eyesight failed. She walked less, wrote less, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to advise government committees by letter. She still read medical journals. She sent notes of encouragement to young nurses and former students, always focused on the mission, never on nostalgia. And then there was the letter. Sometime near the turn of the century, no one knows the exact date, Florence wrote a personal note. It was short, private, not addressed to anyone famous, but it included a single line that's puzzled historians ever since. "The work will continue, but not in my name." No one knows exactly what she meant. Was it modesty? A request for anonymity? A final push against hero worship? Some think she feared becoming a brand, a face that overshadowed the substance of her reforms. Others believe she felt disappointed that despite all the progress, hospitals still struggled with basic hygiene and governments still underfunded care. Whatever the reason, she didn't elaborate. And not long after, she put her pen down for the final time. On August 13th in the year 1910, Florence Nightingale died peacefully in her sleep. She was 90 years old. The government offered to bury her in Westminster Abbey, among kings, poets, and prime ministers. Her family declined. Instead, she was buried in a quiet country cemetery in Hampshire, next to her parents. Her tombstone was simple. No title, no flourish. It read only, F.N., born May 12, 1820, died August 13th, 1910. That was it. But in truth, Florence Nightingale didn't need a monument, because the real monument was already everywhere. It was in the clean white beds of a children's ward, in the data sheets used by public health officials, in the scrubs of a nurse who understands both science and compassion, in the idea that care is not just charity, it is structure, design, and discipline. She had reshaped what it meant to care for another human being, and she had done it without permission, without precedent, and without ever asking for applause. So the next time you walk through a hospital corridor, hear the beeping of machines, or watch a nurse quietly adjust a blanket, remember, that system, imperfect as it may still be, stands on the shoulders of a woman who was told to sit down, stay quiet, and let men handle it. She didn't, and because of that, millions lived.